All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Today we are going to be discussing the impact of the New York Safe for Kids Act. I think a lot of people have been, curious about this, especially hearing from the governor's office and the attorney general's office, but we wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive here and talk about how, the requirements of this legislation in seeking to help teenagers could actually end up harming, our most marginalized or vulnerable teens, or even invading their privacy. At this point, the New York Attorney General's office is soliciting comments from impacted groups to help guide the implementation of the New York Safe for Kids Act. So today we'll learn more about how policies like this one and others impact marginalized and vulnerable youth, what's happening in New York, and the different ways that groups can make their voices heard with the New York Attorney General's office in implementing the law. But before we dive in, I'd like to give a quick introduction of our panelists today. As you see, we have joining us LGBT Tech NYC, and Woodhull Freedom Foundation. Online here, we have Shae Gardner, who is a fabulous LGBTQ plus advocate and technology policy expert who is always working to ensure that the unique needs of her community are being considered and addressed in an increasingly digital world. At LGBT Tech, Shae drives policy strategy and research efforts and works to help address the challenges that are faced by the LGBTQ plus community in online spaces. We also have joining us Mandy Salley, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit human rights organization dedicated to defending the autonomy of all individuals in the areas of free speech, privacy, and sexual freedom. In this role, Mandy oversees the foundation's programmatic and policy work. And last but not least, we also have joining us Julian Kline, who is the founder of Kline Public Strategies, a boutique government and community relations firm in New York. Julian represents and previously served as the head of policy at Tech NYC, which is a nonprofit association and advocacy group representing the tech industry in New York. I'd like to thank you all for just making the time here to be here today to help relay some very important messaging, especially from the perspectives of your organizations who are doing such great work in this area. So I think to kick things off, we should probably discuss, for our attendees here, just exactly what the New York Safe for Kids Act is. And what it does and how it relates to some other legislation that we've seen at the federal and state level. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Julian and Hope, one of our policy analysts from Chamber of Progress who works on speech issues, to discuss the legislation, other federal and state legislation that we've seen that are impacting kids.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I can start with some information about this law in New York and some of the background and kind of the main concepts and how they impact communities. And then Hope, I'll rely on you to fill in details on the federal level and other states. I this year spent a lot of time on behalf of Tech NYC and with Marjorie Velasquez, who leads their policy efforts in Albany, working on the New York Safe for Kids Act and as well as the Child Data Protection Act. And we spent a lot of time up there just making sure that legislators knew what the bills meant and that the bill sponsors and councils and everyone else involved had as much feedback as possible to make amendments and clarify the bills as much as they could before they passed, which some of that was done. We also spent a lot of time breaking down these bills and going over them with various community members And that was from nonprofits that serve the LGBTQ community to those serving senior citizens, immigrants, and other communities, so that groups could feel prepared to weigh in if they chose to do so, especially on aspects of these bills that could have prevented communities from accessing information online that's useful to them, whether that was through limiting algorithms or incorporating parental consent or establishing age verification processes. The two bills that passed in June this year had a unique and somewhat rare combination behind them, which was in addition to motivated bill sponsors, they also had a state attorney general who was personally lobbying legislators for these bills, as well as a governor who was really working the press very actively to build momentum for them. The bills were signed into law about 2 weeks after they were passed in June. And now, which will be discussed a little more later, New York is entering the first phase or is in the first phase of a rulemaking process, which will take about probably a year in total to complete. I know Brianna is going to go over some of it more later. And currently the Attorney General's office is soliciting input from any stakeholders, whether that's social media companies, or other folks who might be impacted by this, to help inform their rulemaking process before it officially kicks off and the clock starts ticking on it. The Safe for Kids Act, from its core, was presented and messaged as a bill to fight addictive feed algorithms and reduce mental health impacts on youth from social media. Although neither the bill sponsors or the folks pushing for it found or presented really significant data or reports on this. And you probably know if you're on this Zoom, there's not that much that directly ties social media to mental health outcomes, given the countless other variables impacting the lives of youth today, including, parenting, parents, monitoring or providing phone usage and access, and also the countless other things, right? Like today's youth having, gone through COVID and studying from home for years. The main premise of the Safe for Kids Act is to remove the algorithms behind a social media feed or a feed of content that have user views that might promote, prioritize, recommend, or determine the order of content that the youth are under 18 are seeing. And that would be unless their parents give consent to those algorithms existing and working with their feeds. Youth will still be able to view content that is not specifically targeted to them or anything related to them, like their location or viewing history or accounts they follow. And youth will still be able to view content from accounts that they choose to follow or subscribe to. The law also prevents platforms from sending notifications to youth between 12 a.m. and midnight and 6 a.m. unless their parents consent to it. And these two main concepts, the limitation of algorithms and the overnight notifications, right, they allow for parental consent, right? And so the final bill also says that, online platforms have to give directions on parental consent in the 12 most commonly spoken languages in New York. And that was done to address some of the community concerns that were brought up. Regarding youth having access to or using social media, eliminating an algorithm has not been proven to keep any certain type of content from being searchable or followed or viewed by youth. And it's not necessarily a complete policy to address the overall arching goal of the bill from the sponsors. Algorithms themselves at the moment play a large part in preventing users from viewing violent, explicit, or hateful content. And they also allow users to view relevant information, for example, content originating or relevant to certain regions or geographies, right? You might be things, in New York might be different than if you live in Minnesota, or broken down by certain neighborhoods, right? You might have language limitations, in other things. And also, right, this impacts users viewing or seeing completely unrelated information, right? Which is kind of what happens when you don't have an algorithm. A non-algorithm based feed is susceptible to manipulation by users. So for example, it could incentivize users to post much more frequently to gain visibility, right? And act in ways that feeds, with algorithms do act. And youth can also easily access VPNs to circumvent location-based restrictions. Many harm prevention services, community groups, educational forums, and other resources target, right, and speak to youth online based on their interests and viewing habits. So this bill, while it seeks to eliminate harmful influences on youth, it also eliminate positive and educational influences on them, especially those that use advertising and other ways to gain exposure. The parental consent requirements for this law, the bill sponsor also acknowledged that if the law helps a bunch of people, but still doesn't help some people because of the downfalls of parental consent, they were okay with that. There's a wide range of the population who is unable to obtain parental consent, whether that's how their household is made up, whether their parents consent of their rights, gender, sexual identification, their lifestyles, whether they're in foster care or government care, or anything else. And I think one of the main issues with this law that folks are hoping to resolve or partially fix in rulemaking is that the bill sponsors did not define properly social media the way it has been done elsewhere. And so, to accurately do that, you can describe the functions of social media, like a user having a profile, a user following or subscribing to other users, messaging between users, and generating content. The law goes in a completely different direction. And so because of this, many other websites or apps that allow people to post content or comments, like blogs, online marketplaces, and messaging platforms, they could still be considered addictive feed platforms. And so applying all these regulations could also limit youth having access to other types of services and platforms beyond, what you would call standard social media. The age verification process, the standards from the Child Data Protection Bill that also passed seem to be a little better, as they could be interpreted as a combination of existing known information given by users about their age, combined with like a self-attestation of your age. The SAFE Act's mandatory age verification process would require users to submit a proof of identification. This could include government documents, proof of banking accounts, and right, this is enforced by fines and legal liability, right? So it's taken very seriously. This requires the collection of a lot more information to determine age. And so there are communities, right, that are distrustful of the collection of more of their information online, that are, and this also could make people more susceptible to internet-based fraud, right, by normalizing the submission and handing over of sensitive information and data of yours. So there are a lot of concerns related to that, in just the processing and collecting of additional data related to age verification. I think to just close it out, some other things earlier this year, California's Privacy Protection Agency drafted a memo on some proposals to amend their data privacy law, which stated that about age verification, that California found there's currently no privacy protective way to determine whether a consumer is a child, imposing age estimation processes could come at expense of citizens and their privacy by incentivizing additional data collection, and that current age verification systems aren't sufficiently advanced to ensure the accurate age verification while protecting privacy. And I think just some additional notes, right? There are youth online, if you are not in a city, if you don't have access to community centers, friendly resources, places you can go, a lot of community building is done online. And so, that's important, right, for people to still have access to and be able to meet and speak with people freely online.
Thank you so much, Julian, for that really thorough overview of the SAFE Act and providing all of this context and touching on some of the impacts that Shae and Mandy will get into a little bit later. But for right now, I'd love to really demonstrate how this all isn't really happening in a vacuum, right? Hope, our excellent policy analyst at Chamber of Progress who works on these kids' online speech issues, she's going to give us an overview of as we all know, the federally proposed legislation, KOSA, or the Kids Online Speech Act, which I believe is in a markup hearing right now. And then also in other states, particularly blue states, where we've seen similar legislation. So Hope, I'd love to turn it over to you to kind of give those two overviews.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten, and thank you, Julian. So as we discussed about the New York Safe for Kids Act, we've also seen that this is similar to legislation that we've seen on both the federal and state levels. So on the federal level, like Kirsten mentioned, the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA for short, which is being marked up right now, includes similar provisions as the New York Safe Act, like the vague and easily weaponized duty of care and harmful to minors standards, which empower state attorneys general and federal lawmakers to sue online platforms for hosting content that they believe to be harmful to minors. So not only is this extremely vague, but in many states, we've seen attorneys general that have harmful agendas in mind, including attacking LGBTQ plus gender affirming and reproductive care resources, as well as anti-racism content. So in this dangerous scenario enabled by KOSA, or legislation such as KOSA and the New York Safe for Kids Act, content would be at the whim of elected officials' radical and discriminatory agendas. And they're not hiding it. KOSA sponsor Marsha Blackburn said it herself, and she said, quote, "KOSA could protect minor children from the transgender in this culture and that influence," end quote. And most recently, the Heritage Foundation, authors and the people behind the Project 2025, which includes a dangerous blueprint for another Trump presidency, admitted that KOSA provides a way for them to restrict access for patients seeking reproductive care or resources online. In terms of state legislation, we've also seen, as Kirsten mentioned, a lot of blue states that have weighed in on this issue in an effort to replicate or build their own version of KOSA. We've seen state legislatures consider legislation that includes requirements for age verification, parental consent, banning of algorithms, and more empowering state officials like attorneys generals to take legal action to remove content that they deem to be inappropriate or harmful, which we have seen includes life-saving resources for young people online. So similar to New York's Safe for Kids Act, we've seen California's social media youth addiction law, SB 976, which I believe is on Governor Newsom's desk. We've seen the Maryland's Kids Code passed in this spring, which allowed the secret monitoring of kids' social media by parents. And then there's also another bill in New Jersey right now, AB 4644, which is being considered, that includes age verification requirements, content moderation, and algorithmic monitoring. We're expecting to see more bills similar bills from more states in 2025 during legislative sessions, and we will be ready to engage with policymakers to express our opposition to some of the key provisions proposed that may end up doing more harm than they do good. And I just want to close by saying, like, we agree that it is of the utmost importance to protect young people online, and we do strive for a digital world that is inclusive and safe for everyone. But it is also imperative that that the policies being considered do not harm communities that are often left out of the conversations at the hands of politicians who seek to harm them. So that is a wrap up on the federal and state legislation state of play. And I'll kick it back to you, Kirsten.
I'd like to just share something really quickly before we move on, if that would be okay. Woodhull has been engaged in fighting against KOSA for what feels like forever, right? Because KOSA's been moving all over the Hill for a couple of years now. But this morning, I actually read a letter that is from youth to our legislators about KOSA. And I'm going to read from it because I think it's really impactful and kind of gets to the point of the issues with a lot of this legislation. And I'm reading now. They say KOSA won't stop the spying or the addictive design or the bullying and abuse. All KOSA will do is censor the good parts that we need to grow up, like information and resources about world events, reproductive health, and LGBTQ plus communities, things that are increasingly banned at school or in the library. So I think it, sort of, as you mentioned, Kirsten, these things are not happening in a vacuum. There's a lot of legislation out there, proposed legislation around the internet and tech, but we also have to look at how youth are being impacted offline. And so creating more policy that is going to restrict content, restrict access is really problematic. And so I just share that because I think it really gets to the heart of the issue.
Thank you so much, Mandy. I really appreciate you plugging that point in and really just demonstrating that this is a movement. It's not all of these random ideas that are just coincidentally happening at the same time. And, with that point, I'd love to kick it over to Shae and to you to kind of discuss some of these key provisions that we've seen throughout these bills and how they're affecting, the censorship, privacy, and really the access for young people that are, marginalized and vulnerable. And maybe not having, as Julian mentioned, the correct type of household, or things like that, or the correct type of identity to comply with some of these laws.
Thank you. And thank you for pulling together this group of people. This is so much information coming from all directions, and it is so nice to have it in one place and in 1 hour. Whenever we are having sort of this conversation around digital governance being based in protecting children, I always like to start by explaining why there is a need to account for LGBTQ plus rights in this space. Firstly, it is because our history is one of having identities and expressions that have been criminalized under the idea of morality or under protecting children. So we've seen that throughout history, and we see that still today, unfortunately, that opponents of LGBTQ plus rights are very, very comfortable, have been and still are very comfortable claiming that to expose children to LGBTQ plus existence is inherently to harm them. Secondly, when you're talking about our community in particular, the unique challenge of lacking safe and understanding physical communities makes online spaces unbelievably vital for fostering a sense of belonging. We know that LGBTQ plus youth are reportedly far more honest about themselves online than they are in physical spaces. We know that they report that those online spaces are far more affirming for them. Those same numbers show that the majority of LGBTQ plus youth are not actually in affirming homes, which ties in a lot of what we've already talked about here. And finally, we know that LGBTQ plus youth without access to affirming spaces are at a much greater risk of hurting themselves. So all that to say, when you are talking about keeping kids safe online, for LGBTQ plus kids, access is a matter of safety. So I'll talk a little bit in particular about specific provisions that we really look for and that I like to say throw up our red flags. We see danger in them. The short answer to that is that we look for provisions that either risk censoring content or impeding access. And both of those are very much at stake in the Safe for Kids Act and in the others like it around the states. In particular, we look for online legislation that calls out preventing, quote, harm to children in vague and subjective language about what harm actually entails. Ambiguity in defining harm allows for interpretations influenced by biases, which can lead to unintentional censorship or intentional suppression of LGBTQ plus voices online. Similarly, we watch for state level online platform regulations that use either best interest of the child language or those that adopt the term obscene or those similar to it to designate what material is inappropriate for minors to access, because we think that this mirrors the historical misuse of obscenity laws against the LGBTQ plus community. Those are sort of a content censorship provisions, looking into sort of the prevention of access. Platform regulations often will include provisions mandating age verification, That's Julian went into that into some great detail. But there's a litany of issues around the actual application of these systems, everything from the fact that marginalized and transgender individuals are far less likely to have the sort of identification required to provide to actually go through the process of verification, as well as significant privacy concerns around the gathering of such information. In that same vein, parental consent requirements, which while ostensibly are intended to provide parents with control over their child's online activities, really may exacerbate the challenges faced by LGBTQ plus youth. Not only does parental consent raise similar privacy and technical application challenges as age verification, but when it comes to LGBTQ plus youth, I mentioned it earlier, but research indicates that a significant portion of them are not in supportive or affirming homes. This leaves youth vulnerable to rejection, to discrimination, and even something we've been saying is a loss of housing, which we know does disproportionately affect LGBTQ plus teens alongside already worsened mental health outcomes. So for us, imposing parental consent requirements for accessing LGBTQ plus resources and support networks risks really further isolating these youth and limiting their access to vital information in communities. So I will wrap all that up and say, I believe that this New York bill and many of the others like it are so well-intentioned. Unfortunately, well-intentioned bills can still open the door to much less well-intentioned interpretations and unintentional chilling effects for the users and the youth who rely on these platforms the most. And when we are in a country with year-over-year record-breaking anti-LGBTQ plus legislation in the States, that's a risk we can't take. We have to be more cautious.
I would say +1, everything Shae just said. I think she said it way more eloquently than how I'm about to illustrate my thoughts. But I want to expand a little bit about the age verification piece that you touched on. The act specifically says it will require social media companies to use commercially reasonable methods to determine age. And what we know from looking outside of the US is that that is not possible with the technology we currently have. So Woodhull wrote a piece on our blog called "The Fact Check: Is online verification the same as flashing your ID at a liquor store?" And we said, no, it's not. And in that piece, we write about how Australia, the UK, and France have all done the research and said you can't age verify this way and still protect people's privacy online. So we have big concerns with that particular sentence in this piece of legislation. But I also want to bring it back to our human rights. Woodhull is a human rights organization, and the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed in 1948, Article 12 says, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, and everyone has the right to the protection of law against such interference or attacks. So we feel that age verification is very much a privacy violation, and because of what I just read to you, human rights violation, which is one of the big reasons we disagree with this piece of legislation. But of course, it's also a First Amendment violation. The First Amendment gives us the right to speak, but it also gives us the right to access information. So this law, as my brilliant co-panelists have already illustrated, definitely violates that right and seeks to limit the access of youth to information. I'm going to quote the UDHR one more time. I promise it'll be the last time I do it on this panel today. But Article 19 says that we have a right to free expression, and it ends by saying that we have the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. So I would say that is inclusive of the internet, of our libraries. And again, all of this information is in our fact check program on our website. So I appreciate you letting us share a little bit about that here today.
Thank you both so much. I mean, what strong demonstrations of really the unintended consequences, I suppose. I hate that phrase, but they really are. With this bill, as Shae mentioned, we don't think that legislators, or at least certain legislators, particularly in New York, are trying to go after marginalized and vulnerable communities. But unless these perspectives are brought to them, there isn't really any way for them to know, and that is our job. Mandy did touch on this with the First Amendment, but in addition to concerns about implementation, concerns about impact, there's also concerns that the New York Safe for Kids Act will face some of the same legal challenges that have halted bills in other states. And we have with us Carrie Sheehan, who is our new legal counsel at Chamber of Progress, to discuss some of these legal hurdles that we're anticipating the New York Safe for Kids Act will face.
Hi. So picking up on some of what Mandy already discussed, I would say, like similar laws that have been blocked in Arkansas, California, Ohio, and Utah, the New York Safe for Kids Act has some serious constitutional infirmities. As the Supreme Court recently affirmed in their ruling in Moody v. Net Choice earlier this year, algorithmic curation is central to the editorial functions of platforms and is itself entitled to First Amendment protection as an expressive activity. According to Justice Kagan, who wrote the majority opinion in that case, algorithmic curation and moderation is expressive activity of its own, and laws that interfere with the platform's decisions to use algorithmic curation or moderation are unlikely to pass First Amendment scrutiny. Second, I'd say that the SAFE Act requires age detection and verification. We've already highlighted the practical and normative flaws with that. I would say, going back to the seminal case on online speech, Reno versus ACLU in 1997, the Supreme Court pretty affirmatively stated that laws that require age verification and age restrictions place an unacceptable burden on adults' access to information as well as kids' access to information. And as Julian said, there is no privacy protective way to implement age verification, and that can have a chilling effect on adults' willingness to join or use platforms that have age verification implemented. Third, there is a strong constitutional protection for minors' access to speech and information, including algorithmic speech. That access can't be suppressed solely because a legislative body thinks it's unsuitable for them. The Supreme Court was pretty emphatic about this in Brown versus Merchants and Entertainment Association, a 2011, I believe, case regarding access to violent video games. Supreme Courts and lower courts have been emphatic that minors are entitled to a significant measure of First Amendment protection, and only in narrow and well-defined circumstances can a government bar dissemination of protected speech to them. Fourth, with regard to the provision that minors can access curated feeds with parental consent, along with the practical challenges and the risks to vulnerable youth that those provisions impose, the Supreme Court has rejected the idea that the state has the power to prevent minors from hearing or saying anything without their parents' consent. Even if more parental supervision over youth media access was desirable, such laws don't actually enforce parental authority. What they do is substitute the government's authority subject to a parental veto. Courts have also found that parental consent requirements also undermine the state's purported goal of protecting children from harmful content or harmful algorithms in this case. If the harm is serious enough to justify restricting minors' access to that content, why is it okay if one parent were to consent? Lastly, similar laws in Arkansas, California, Utah, and Ohio have been enjoined by courts who've indicated that the laws like this are unlikely to survive First Amendment scrutiny. The New York Safe for Kids Act is likely to face the same fate.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I really appreciate you going over those legal hurdles. As you know, I'm not an attorney. I don't know if anyone else on this call is, but it's really great to hear that, this bill will probably have the same fate as some of those, but it also brings up the question as why legislators keep pushing forth these bills that keep getting shot down in courts or enjoined in the courts. So that's just another reason, if all the other reasons we've given you aren't enough, if you're really looking at the legality of it, there are definitely some issues here. And now moving on to probably one of the most important parts of this webinar for our attendees, it's engaging with the New York Attorney General's office on the New York Safe for Kids Act. This is really the main reason we wanted to put this webinar together, is so that groups could be informed and understand the regulatory process, what this bill does, the impacts of it, and basically where they're able to make their voice heard throughout implementation with the Attorney General's office, so they understand really that there really isn't a lot to for groups. There's a lot for groups to say. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. There's a lot for groups to say, and like we mentioned at the beginning, that if these perspectives aren't brought to the Attorney General's office, they may go out and do implementation in a way that further harms or marginalizes these communities. So it's very important that they hear from you, that they hear from groups that they, care about in a lot of different other aspects. It's important for them to know that they have a point of view when it comes to these social media bills. So I'd love to turn it over to Brianna, our state and local lead for New York, who's there a lot of the time on the ground talking to legislators and communicating with them about these concerns. I'd love to turn it over to her to kind of demonstrate how and why it's important to engage with the Attorney General's office in New York.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. If you weren't already concerned about the Safe for Kids Act, I hope that after hearing from our brilliant advocates on the panel today that you are and that you will be engaged. One of the most important takeaways from today's conversation is that this really is the last opportunity for stakeholders to engage and to make your voice and the voice of those that you represent heard. The law has been enacted. We've already heard it's been signed. It's already set to go into effect. This regulatory process is truly the last chance for us to shape how the law will be implemented and ultimately how it will impact your relevant communities. So that said, the AG's office is asking for detailed comments, especially around things that we've talked about today, like age verification, specific impacts on marginalized communities. Online, there are dozens, and I mean literally dozens, of questions that the AG's office has posted seeking responses to. You're welcome to respond to each one of those, but you can also share your concerns and comments in a more generalized perspective as well. As Julian said earlier, the rulemaking process is expected to last at least a year. We're not talking about implementing something simple here. This is very complex policy that has a lot of impact in various areas of public life that we've talked about today. So this is going to take a while. But the first step in that process is the initial comments period that we are in right now. So initial comments are due September 30th via written submission. It can be a letter, it can be an email, it can be bullet points to the email address that you have here on your screen, protectnykidsonline@ag.ny.gov. As you've heard today, we do encourage you to submit your own comments about specific impacts of the law on your communities. But there is also an opportunity to sign on to Chamber of Progress's formal comments that we plan to submit. We know that many of you are truly on the front lines of advocacy and you just might not have the bandwidth and capacity to gather your own comments, and that is completely fair. And so we very much welcome if anyone wants to join onto ours, if that is your situation. Also important to note is that the Attorney General's office is actively taking one-on-one meetings specific to the Safe for Kids Act. We've heard that several stakeholders have been successful in getting those meetings with the AG's office, not with the Attorney General herself, but with qualified counsel and staff that are taking a look at the regulatory process and how the law will be implemented. So we encourage you to set up those meetings as well. Chamber of Progress is planning to do so once we submit our final comments at the end of the month. We will be pursuing a one-on-one meeting. And so after September 30th, after the Attorney General's office has had these meetings, they will then process all of the feedback that they receive, which should be a lot given just the breadth and depth of communities and population impacted by the law. And then they will actually formulate their final draft regulations. Being that they are draft, we will have another opportunity to comment. That period will only be 60 days long. And so once those draft rules are published, we'll have 60 days to comment, but that's really more of a technical opportunity to comment on the impacts of, or I should say the relative mechanisms of actually implementing the technical sides of the law. It's not so much your opportunity to comment on the big ethical and values-based concerns that we've talked about today. That's right now. So all of that is to say that there's tons of information online on exactly how to engage. Here at Chamber of Progress, I am available, Kirsten's available. We are always happy to help you in seeking to engage, whether it's via written comments, one-on-one meetings. The more voices that the Attorney General's office hears and the more communities that speak up on how they will be impacted by the law, ultimately, hopefully it will shape how the regulations will finally be drafted and will be implemented in a way that we can at least try to lessen the impact, the unintentional consequences of the law itself. So that said, I'll kick it back to Kirsten, who I'm sure will have some more information on how you can engage with us to get assigned onto our comments, if that's what you see best fit. And of course, you're always welcome to submit your own plus sign on to a coalition supported formal process as well.
Thank you so much for that important overview, Brianna, about engaging with the New York Attorney General's office. Like she mentioned, she is in contact with them, and she understands all the, I's that you have to dot and the T's that you have to cross. So if there are questions on process, we'd be happy to answer them for folks. And as she mentioned, we will be submitting our own comments. We frankly, don't care if folks sign on to our comments as long as they're participating and engaging. There's no ownership there. We just really want the Attorney General's office to be overwhelmed by comments from groups and perspective from groups that they just haven't heard or they haven't considered. And we really want them to know that it's important for them to do that. And for them to understand that they need to be overwhelmed by comments and just communication from various groups. And I know that we've thrown a lot at you folks today between all of the different bills and processes and impact that we've discussed, but I'd like to open it up just for any questions from attendees that our brilliant panelists could help answer on impact, that Brianna could help answer about what's going on with the Attorney General's office, or that Hope and Julian could help answer any technical questions about the bills. And I don't think I can see the questions. Mark, if you're able to see them.
Looks like folks are a little shy. No questions have been submitted. So I know we might give our panelists an opportunity to say anything that we haven't yet discussed or bring up any other additional concerns with the bill.
Yeah, if there's any other comments that folks have as well from their respective organizations, if they've been focusing on these bills, we'd love for you to share them here too. But if not, I'm happy to send around information of all of our panelists to folks that attended, if there's other questions that they might want to ask offline and those sorts of things. Maybe give it another minute in case someone's typing anything.
Well, Kirsten, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut Brianna off. Go ahead.
How about we'll do this? We'll do Brianna, then Mandy.
I was just going to add that while these formal comment processes are extremely important for getting your thoughts directly to the Attorney General's office as it's forming the draft regulations, there are also other ways to engage. We've seen some local LGBTQ groups publish really stellar op-eds about the process overall and the impact on the community. We've seen folks on social media expressing concerns. So there are other ways, in addition to submitting some formal comments, if you have the capacity and you are interested in more, let's say, creative outlets to also express concerns, that is surely welcome.
That's great. Thank you, Brianna, for mentioning that. There are definitely a variety of ways to engage here, and the media is also another great one to use. Mandy, I'd love to hear what you were about to say as well.
Well, I wanted to mention that if folks here are not from New York, these bills are happening all over the place. And so I would say, stay tuned to all of these organizations and their great resources, because if it hasn't come to your state, I'm sure it's coming soon. But the other thing I wanted to say is one of the common questions I get asked when we are speaking in opposition to bills like these, and we didn't really touch on this too much in our conversation, but I think it's an important one, is, well, what do I do if I am concerned about the harms that are posed on the internet. And I just want to sort of put a plug out there that all of these platforms have their own like child safety protections built in that parents can use, as well as there's a wonderful resource or an organization called the Family Online Safety Institute that is a really great guide for how to keep your kids safe online, how to talk to your kids about these things. And so I want to just assure people who might be concerned that our lawmakers aren't doing anything, that there are actually already resources out there outside of our state houses and outside of our elected officials available to people to try and keep folks safe online without restricting the rights of all of us and our ability to access information. So I just wanted to kind of add that, give people some information, some resources, places to go if they wanted more information.
Thank you so much, Mandy. Yes, that is so true. We didn't want to leave folks hanging or in fear that if their legislators aren't getting this right, then who is? There are a variety of outside resources and organizations that do care, just like some of my fabulous panelists here. And plenty others. We do love the Family Online Safety Institute as well. They put forth great programming and material on how to stay safe online. Because I think, as we all know, you know, I think kids being online is something that will continue in the future, and there are very, very good impacts of it. But it's kind of like getting a driver's license, right? You don't know who else is out there on the road, and you want to be careful. But you still need to drive sometimes. So with that being said, I want to highlight a couple of different resources that help drove this conversation today. Particularly from our panelists and their organizations. They do a wonderful job with programming. I want to make sure folks can see my screen, right? Okay, great. And we'll be sending this around to folks that attended this webinar today. But I really recommend, you know, if you're just getting into this space or just trying to learn out like what these bills are, how are they impacting these groups, all of these resources really speak to that. That we have one specific to the New York bill itself, on just general regulations and how that they may be attacking and harming the LGBTQ plus community, as well as resources on KOSA, and as we talked about, the First Amendment and online expression. So I hope that folks really take these to heart and look through them. And like I said, we are all available if folks have questions or want to talk again about some of these issues a little bit deeper, so they can get a better understanding. But with that being said, if there are, just want to do another plug for any questions or comments that are out there. But I do want to thank our fabulous panelists again, who joined our conversation today, who were excellent. I didn't really have to prep at all because they all already talk about this stuff every single day. And of course, some of my teammates here from Chamber of Progress, providing their expertise as well. Before we log off, if there's any last thoughts that our panelists want to leave our attendees before we go, of like their top thing that they want them to remember, I think that would be a really great way to close us out.
I'm happy to take the first stab at it here and say that I think something is so important to remember in this conversation is that youth is not a monolith, that there are so many different needs out there, and that when you are looking at legislation like this, which treats this sort of situation with a one-size-fits-all approach, and even as talked about earlier in this conversation, has kind of decided that some of those needs are okay to dismiss in favor of others, you're putting everybody on the internet in a really dangerous position. So I also love to hear this is, I feel like I'm going off track now, but I loved the KOSA letter from the youth earlier, because this is a conversation where I always have to respect that or recognize that we are talking for kids and about kids, and it is wonderful to hear their voices in it as well. So all in all, youth are not a monolith. Elevate youth voices.
Thanks, Shae. Mandy, let's kick it to you. What's your top thing you want folks to take away from this?
Yeah, well, something your comments bring to mind, Shae, is a phrase we hear in the advocacy world a lot, which is like, basically, don't do it for us without us, right? We need feedback from the impacted communities to really write excellent legislation. And I think the other thing that I just want folks to know is oftentimes legislators are writing these laws with good intentions and not enough information. So if you are somebody who has the information or you've been impacted by something like this, it's really important to communicate that to our lawmakers. And you don't have to be an expert in tech or human rights or any of those things to make your voice heard and share your experiences. Your lawmakers work for you. Your votes got them there, and your lack of votes, gets them out of there as well. So I think the thing I just want to leave with people is empowering them to make their voice heard however they want to do that. And this is an excellent opportunity to actually take part in a lawmaking process, which we don't get very often. So I think if you're a New Yorker, please submit a comment. It doesn't have to be super fancy or articulate. It just has to be there.
Thank you so much. And I love the reiteration of holding your legislators accountable. And Julian, from the policy side of things, what is one thing that you want folks to remember to take away from this presentation?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think, there was a lot of interesting additional context I heard here. I think bringing in as many additional voices into this as possible. One sad thing about lawmaking processes in general is that oftentimes people hear about things after they pass and after they get signed into law. And it's, usually too late, and people say, why did this happen? And so unfortunately, that is frequently the case. And I encourage folks here to just continue to do community building, especially as these laws are considered and discussed across the country, and make sure there's thorough engagement in other states. The AG's kind of comment process and feedback process right now, there are really interesting questions. It does seem like they're really interested in the logistics of how age verification works and some of the solutions that have been out there. And if folks have experience with those solutions, or even from a consumer end, right? How do they work, and how do you put in information, or how your community members have done that? That's all really, really useful, because the Attorney General's office are not technologists necessarily, and they don't build websites, and they might not know how these things work. So it's on everyone to help fill in those gaps in information for them.
Definitely a great point being made that the Attorney General's office are not technologists. I know that's something that we all probably realize, but when it comes to putting forth rules for legislation that is very technology related and impacting marginalized and vulnerable communities, we shouldn't, we want to put trust in our lawmakers, but we shouldn't just trust but not verify, right? So I think it's very important to bring those perspectives. And Brianna, just from where you've been in the state houses and working with lawmakers and regulators on these things, what's something that you want folks to remember?
I don't think that I can say anything better than what's already been said, but just a reminder that we are here as resources and amplifiers when we can be. So please do engage, and please do not be shy to reach out on anything from the best way to do so to you need help actually submitting. We're happy to help you navigate what can be kind of a confusing space, but we look forward to it.
Definitely. Our goal is to make this process easier for folks to engage. So if there's a way that we can help you do that, we would love to. And with that being said, I think we can Carrie, sorry.
I was just going to give my takeaway, which is that given that courts are so hostile to these laws, I think encouraging the Attorney General to better expend their resources, for example, by studying the effects of algorithms, putting funding into studying the effects of algorithms, studying available parental controls and filtering systems and tools that users can use to limit their expression, supporting comprehensive privacy legislation, and supporting increased user controls for minors and everyone else. I think we should encourage them to go in that direction and not in the direction of unconstitutionally limiting youth and adult speech online.
That's excellent. I think that's so true. There are a variety of ways that the Attorney General's office can and actions that they can do to actually show that they're interested in this issue and care about this issue in a nuanced way. Because as Shae mentioned, youth is not a monolith. So I think we all agree that there's definitely research gaps and more data to have been found out. And with that, I think that we can wrap it up for today. If there are any questions in the chat, I will be looking through them and addressing them separately. But if folks do want to talk to us one-on-one, I will be sending out the presentation and the contact information for all of our panelists. But thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that you take everything that you learned here to heart and you engage in New York with the Attorney General's office in some shape, form, or fashion to make your voice heard in this implementation of the New York Safe for Kids Act. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon.